San Antonio, Texas. Two newborn babies, one swaddled in pink, the other in blue. Their mother gazes down at them. Though they came into the world together, Zach and Rachel will grow up to become two very different people. So what is life as a twin actually like? And can you ever really feel like your own person? Find out. Read Personal Statement, Individual Twin by Zachary Walsdorf.
Personal Statement, Individual Twin. My twin sister Rachel and I were raised to be inseparable. We wore matching clothes before even speaking with one another. But the moment we found a sliver of control over our lives, a distinct split took place between us. It wasn't so much caused by anger or contempt as it was a response to our increasingly diverging personalities and interests. There was an early drive to subvert any expectations of twin equity and prove ourselves as individual people. Those were my feelings, at least. Unfortunately, our twin telepathy never came to be, so I can't confirm the accuracy on her behalf. Regardless, that early drive for independent identity never escaped my mind. All of my current efforts in self-improvement and passion pursuit have stemmed from the motivation to be a unique twin, to meld my own identity, instead of leaving the fairly important task of growing up to chance that would lead to a very uninteresting life with hardly any room for fulfillment. At this point, I wouldn't say I've acted as any sort of classic rebel, but I've certainly worked to combat the ever-looming prospect of conformity over my life. I've certainly rebelled against the hand I was dealt through creative ambitions, having fought vehemently to ensure the honesty in my choices. I've at least found a rebellious sense of self. A rebellious self that learned the trumpet and guitar instead of Rachel's violin, that chose to attend a separate high school and invest time in subjects that attracted me personally. In the last few years, I found passion after passion to adopt and educate myself on. Activities like landscape photography, fashion, and fitness have kept me disciplined and constantly leading an exciting life of expression. Pursuing leadership positions within clubs like NHS and UNICEF to foster my love for both public speaking and the valuable communities I adore. I choose to spend my free time building towards a vision of meaning in my personal world as I work up to larger plans of change. Everything from developing a personal style to pondering the merit of various value sets has enthralled me, because all of it exists as an exploration of self, furthering the identity that means the world to me. My improvements in day-to-day life are tinkerings on the much larger project I view my life to be, always expanding my perspective and talents in countless sun-dry fields. By embracing this process, I found the incredible reward of an identity I'm finally proud to call my own. Building it started as a necessity, something that needed to happen before I could grow up and join the world. It's like that for everyone, I suppose, but I've always felt my twin brought a heightened urgency to my case. It started as a defensive measure as I saw the consequence of apathy, but developed into a passion that has fueled all my other passions in life. My twin sister, with whom I share more experience than anyone in the world today, gave me the permanent gift of individuality. Without her, it's hard to imagine I would have been so motivated to discover many of my most treasured attributes today. I doubt I'd have found a love for outdoor exploration or the exploration of Bob Dylan's legendary discography, for Ultimate Frisbee Club or the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Without her, I wouldn't have spent nearly as long uncovering and reinforcing the qualities that make me, me. I have always tried to take the control of my future out of my environment's hands as if part of some responsibility-driven counterculture. However, given time, it's become increasingly evident that those same hands were what first ushered me towards that control. The threat of existing as a double of sorts pushed me into the mindset of robust individuality I cherish more than anything today. When breath becomes air. Forward. It occurs to me as I write this that the foreword to this book might be better thought of as an afterword, because when it comes to Paul Kalanithi, all sense of time is turned on its head. To begin with, or maybe to end with, I got to know Paul only after his death. Bear with me. I came to know him most intimately when he'd ceased to be. I met him one memorable afternoon at Stanford in early February 2014. He just published an op-ed titled, "How Long Have I Got Left?" In the New York Times, an essay that would elicit an overwhelming response, an outpouring from readers. In the ensuing days, it spread exponentially. I'm an infectious disease specialist, so please forgive me for not using the word viral as a metaphor. In the aftermath of that, he'd asked to come see me to chat, to get advice about literary agents, editors, the publishing process. He had a desire to write a book. This book, the one you are now holding in your hands. I recall the sun filtering through the magnolia tree outside my office and lighting this scene. Paul seated before me, his beautiful hands exceedingly still, his prophet's beard full, those dark eyes taking the measure of me. In my memory, the picture has a Vermeer-like quality, a camera obscura sharpness. I remember thinking, you must remember this because what was falling on my retina was precious. And because in the context of Paul's diagnosis, I became aware of not just his mortality, but my own. We talked about a lot of things that afternoon. He was a neurosurgical chief resident. We had probably crossed paths at some point, but we hadn't shared a patient that we could recall. He told me he had been an English and biology major as an undergraduate at Stanford and then stayed on for a master's in English literature. We talked about his lifelong love of writing and reading. I was struck by how easily he could have been an English professor, and indeed, he had seemed to be headed down the path at one point in his life. But then, just like his namesake on the road to Damascus, he felt the calling. He became a physician instead, but one who always dreamed of coming back to literature in some form. A book, perhaps, one day. He thought he had time, and why not? And yet now time was the very thing he had so little of. I remember his wry, gentle smile, a hint of mischief there, and even though his face was gaunt and haggard, he'd been through the ringer with this cancer, but a new biological therapy had produced a good response, allowing him to look ahead a bit. He said during medical school he'd assumed that he would become a psychiatrist, only to fall in love with neurosurgery. It was much more than a falling in love with the intricacies of the brain, much more than the satisfaction of training his hands to accomplish amazing feats. It was a love and empathy for those who suffered, for what they endured and what he might bring to bear. I don't think he told me this as much as I heard about this quality from his students of mine who were his acolytes, his fierce belief in the moral dimension of his job, and then we talked about his dying. After that meeting, we kept in touch by email but never saw each other again. It was not just that I disappeared into my own world of deadlines and responsibilities, but also my strong sense that the burden was on me to be respectful of his time. It was up to Paul if he wanted to see me. I felt that the last thing he needed was the obligation to service a new friendship. I thought about him a lot, though, and about his wife. I wanted to ask him if he was writing. Was he finding the time? For years, as a busy physician, I'd struggled to find the time to write. I wanted to tell him that a famous writer, commiserating about the eternal problem, once said to me, "If I were a neurosurgeon and I announced that I had to leave my guest to go in for an emergency craniotomy, no one would say a word. But if I said I needed to leave the guest in the living room to go upstairs to write, I wondered if Paul would have found this funny. After all, he could actually say he was going to do a craniotomy. It was plausible, and then he could go write instead." While Paul was writing this book, he published a short, remarkable essay in Stanford Medicine, and an issue that was devoted to the idea of time. He had an essay in the same issue. My piece juxtaposed to his, though I learned of his contribution only when the magazine was in my hands. In reading his words, I had a second, deeper glimpse of something of which there had been a hint in the New York Times essay. Paul's writing was simply stunning. He could have been writing about anything and it would have been just as powerful, but he wasn't writing about anything. He was writing about time and what it meant to him now in the context of his illness, which made it so incredibly poignant. But here's the thing. I must come back to the prose. The prose was unforgettable. Out of his pen, he was spinning gold. I reread Paul's piece again and again, trying to understand what he had brought about. First, it was musical. It had echoes of Galway Kennel, almost a prose poem. If one day it happens, you find yourself with someone you love in a cafe at one end of the Pont Mirabeau at the Zinc Bar, where wine stands in upward opening glasses, to quote a Kennel line from a poem I once heard him recite in a bookstore in Iowa City, never looking down at the paper. But it also had a taste of something else, something from an antique land, from a time before zinc bars. It finally came to me a few days later when I picked up his essay yet again. Paul's writing was reminiscent of Thomas Browne's. Browne had written Religio Medici in the prose of 1642, with all its archaic spellings and speech. As a young physician, I was obsessed with that book, kept at it like a farmer trying to drain a bog that his father before him had failed to drain. It was a futile task, yet I was desperate to learn its secrets, tossing it aside in frustration, then picking it up again. Unsure that it had anything for me, but in the sounding words, sensing that it did. I felt that I lacked some critical receptor for the letters to sing, to impart their meaning. It remained opaque, no matter how hard I tried. Why, you ask? Why did I persevere? Who cares about Religio Medici? Well, my hero William Osler cared, that's who. Osler was the father of modern medicine, a man who died in 1919. He had loved the book. He kept it on his nightstand. He'd asked to be buried with a copy of Religio Medici. For the life of me, I didn't get what Osler saw in it. After many tries and after some decades, the book finally revealed itself to me. It helped me that a newer edition had modern spellings. The trick, I discovered, was to read it aloud, which made the cadence inescapable. We carry with us the wonders we seek without us. There is all Africa and her prodigies in us. We are that bold and adventurous piece of nature, which he that studies wisely learns in compendium, that others labor in a divided piece in endless volume. When you come to the last paragraph of Paul's book, read it aloud and you will hear that same long line, the cadence you think can tap your feet to. But as with Browne, you will be just off. Paul, it occurred to me, was Browne Redux. Or given that forward time is our illusion, perhaps it's that Browne was Kalinithy Redux. Yes, it's head-spinning stuff. And then Paul died. I attended his memorial in the Stanford Church, a gorgeous space where I often go when it is empty to sit and admire the light, the silence, and where I always find renewal. It was packed for the service. I sat off to one side, listening to a series of moving and sometimes raucous stories from his closest friends, his pastor, and his brother. Yes, Paul was gone, but strangely, I felt I was coming to know him. Beyond that visit in my office, beyond the few essays he'd written, he was taking form in those tales being told in the Stanford Memorial Church. Its soaring cathedral dome, a fitting space in which to remember this man whose body was now in the earth, but who nevertheless was so palpably alive. He took form in the shape of his lovely wife and baby daughter, his grieving parents and siblings, in the faces of the legions of friends, colleagues, and former patients who filled that space. He was there at the reception later, outdoors in a setting where so many came together. I saw faces looking calm, smiling as if they had witnessed something profoundly beautiful in the church. Perhaps my face was like that too. We had found meaning in the ritual of a service, in the ritual of eulogizing, in the shared tears. There was further meaning residing in this reception where we slaked our thirst, fed our bodies, and talked with complete strangers to whom we were intimately connected through Paul. But it was only when I received the pages that you now hold in your hands 2 months after Paul died that I felt I had finally come to know him better than if I had been blessed to call him a friend. After reading the book you are about to read, I confess I felt inadequate. There was an honesty, a truth in the writing that took my breath away. Be ready. Be seated. See what courage sounds like. See how brave it is to reveal yourself in this way. But above all, see what it is to still live, to profoundly influence the lives of others after you are gone by your words. In a world of asynchronous communication where we are so often buried in our screens, our gaze rooted to the rectangular objects buzzing in our hands, our attention consumed to ephemera, stop and experience this dialogue with my young departed colleague, now ageless and extant in memory. Listen to Paul. In the silences between his words, listen to what you have to say back. Therein lies his message. I got it. I hope you experience it too. It is a gift. Let me not stand between you and Paul. Prologue. Webster was much possessed by death and saw the skull beneath the skin, and breastless creatures underground leaned backward with a lipless grin. T.S. Eliot, Whispers of Immortality. I flipped through the CT scan images, the diagnosis obvious. The lungs were matted with innumerable tumors, the spine deformed, a full lobe of the liver obliterated, cancer, widely disseminated. I was a neurosurgical resident entering my final year of training. Over the last 6 years, I'd examined scores of such scans on the off chance that some procedure might benefit the patient. But this scan was different. It was my own. I wasn't in the radiology suite wearing my scrubs and white coat. I was dressed in a patient's gown, tethered to an IV pole, using the computer the nurse had left in my hospital room with my wife, Lucy, an internist at my side. I went through each sequence again, the lung window, the bone window, the liver window, scrolling from top to bottom, then left to right, then front to back, just as I had been trained to do so, as if I might find something that would change the diagnosis. We lay together on the hospital bed. Lucy, quietly, as if reading from a script, "Do you think there's any possibility that it's something else?" "No," I said. We held each other tightly. Like young lovers, in the past year, we both suspected, but refused to believe or even discuss that a cancer was growing inside me. About 6 months before, I had started losing weight and having ferocious back pain. When I dressed in the morning, my belt cinched 1, then 2 notches tighter. I went to see my primary care doctor, an old classmate from Stanford. Her sister had died suddenly as a neurosurgery intern after contracting a virulent infection, and so she'd taken a maternal watch on my health. When I arrived, however, I found a different doctor in her office. My classmate was on maternity leave. Dressed in a thin blue gown on a cold examining table, I described the symptoms to her. "Of course," I said, "if there were a board's exam question, 35-year-old with unexplained weight loss and new onset back pain, the obvious answer would be C, cancer. But maybe it's just that I'm working too hard. I don't know, I'd like to get an MRI to be sure." "I think we should get x-rays first," she said. "MRIs for back pains are expensive, and unnecessary imaging had lately become a major national point of cost-saving emphasis. But the value of a scan also depends on what you are looking for. X-rays are largely useless for cancer. Still, for many docs, ordering an MRI at this early stage is apostasy." She continued, "X-rays aren't perfectly sensitive, but it makes sense to start there. How about we get flexion extension X-rays? Then maybe the more realistic diagnosis here is isthmus spondylolisthesis." From the reflection in the wall mirror, I could see her Googling it. It's a pars fracture affecting up to 5% of people and a frequent cause of back pain in the young. "Okay, I'll order them then." "Thanks," I said. Why was I so authoritative in a surgeon's code but so meek in a patient's gown? The truth was, I knew more about back pain than she did. Half of my training as a neurosurgeon had involved disorders of the spine, but maybe a spondy was more likely. It did affect a significant percent of young adults and cancer in the spine in your 30s. The odds of that couldn't be more than 1 in 10,000. Even if it were 100 times more common than that, it'd still be less common than a spondy. Maybe I was just freaking myself out. The x-rays looked fine. We chalked the symptoms up to hard work and an aging body, scheduled a follow-up appointment, and I went back to finish my last case of the day. The weight loss slowed and the back pain became tolerable. A healthy dose of ibuprofen got me through the day, and after all, there weren't that many of these grueling 14-hour days left.